And we are live. What is today? I had my notes. There it is, the 26th, January 26th. Ryan Ray alongside Chris Fenton, Feeding the Dragon Show, Feeding the Dragon podcast, which you can find on iTunes, Spotify, anywhere good podcasts are found. Mr. Fenton, hadn't talked to you since last week. Hope you had a good weekend, sir. How are things in your world?
I had a great weekend. I was hoping there would be maybe a lack of Chinese news so I could relax and not really pay attention to things. But nope, that's not the case.
Yeah, a lot to get to. We probably won't get to, most of what we'd like to talk about. So we'll start with maybe the big news. I say big news. It's kind of hard to evaluate what is the biggest news, but Xi Jinping made headlines when he said in his speech at Davos, and I got a quote here from Axios. It says, "We should respect and accommodate differences, avoid meddling in other countries' internal affairs, and resolve disagreements through consultation and dialogue. History and reality have made it clear time and again that the misguided approach of antagonism and confrontation, be it in the form of a Cold War, hot war, trade war, or tech war, will eventually hurt all countries' interests and undermine everyone's well-being." I saw Bill Bishop in his email yesterday made note that had a Mao feel to it. I don't want to misquote Mr. Bishop here. I'll pull that up. But Chris, your initial thoughts on Xi Jinping's comments in Davos?
Yeah, it just you know what, it reminded me. It's crazy, but like when as a trustee for the U.S. Asian Institute, I do these congressional delegation trips. We haven't done one since last September 2019, but you go and visit all the different branches of regional, provincial, and the Communist Party central government, and every room you walk into sort of has the same party line. It's actually quite remarkable. It's really unified.
Yeah.
And one of the things we heard quite extensively, and the last time I was there was really during the Hong Kong protests. So there was a lot of human rights banter outside of China about what was going on there. And obviously the Xinjiang atrocities were ongoing at that time too, but not quite as much in the headlines as Hong Kong. And, it was a constant sort of message of, we want to work with the United States, respect our differences, we respect yours, like, let's collaborate, let's be strategic competitors, but also, tense allies, or whatever it is. And by the way, we do have internal affairs which we are dealing with on a daily basis, which are our business, not yours. And that was always directed towards the human rights issue, right? So like, if you look at what happened at Davos the other day, he's talking about multilateralism, the ability for the world to conquer challenges together, how we need to collaborate better on things like COVID in the future, and get a more global approach done with everything. Oh, and by the way, we do have internal affairs that are going on in China, so stay the hell out of the way with those. We're not interested in hearing your opinion.
Yeah, and for me, this goes back to, as you say, the Chinese are very good about messaging. And I got Bill Bishop's quote up right here from his newsletter, which everyone should subscribe to. But it says he has a list of articles talking about Xi Jinping's speech. And at the end, his comment is, "So many threads of the Mao era for foreign policy seem still operative, but now China has real power and wealth, and the U.S. looks chaotic and discredited to many." And, it's funny because I've heard some commentators recently speculate that the Maoism is kind of, the Xi Jinping and the CCP have kind of moved on from that. But I do think that Mr. Bishop is on to something there. As far as the external affairs, the issue comes.
Well, by the way, really quick, just on the Mao side of things, like, one thing I've been thinking about in regards to how, sorry about that. One thing I was thinking about in regards to how, the Chinese think overall, right? Like, there's a long-term approach to everything. They play the long game. Mm-hmm. And this Maoism that's in modern day China, which seems so crazy to us, because it would sort of be like saying, hey, things from the Korean Peninsula War are in the mentality of the way Joe Biden is speaking about the country. That seems so distant and far off in history. But in terms of China and the way they think over millennials, over centuries, and the way they guide their strategy moving forward on 25, 50, 75, 100-year planning initiatives, thinking about Maoist principles, thinking about his doctrine and how he governed that country is literally about in terms of us, it's probably thinking about how, the younger George Bush thought about things, right? Like it's not that far back in history regarding the mentality of the Chinese and the way the Chinese government thinks.
Yeah, and I think the thing for me with the U.S. foreign policy, we talk about China, is we have to be careful. We talk about the media, the propaganda. We have to be careful to let the Chinese set the table. And here's what I mean. So we talked about the Hong Kong security law, which basically makes it illegal for me and you to criticize the CCP. So when Xi Jinping's saying this, by definition, he could be talking about our podcast right now is a violation of internal affairs. So we have to start making them at these discussion tables, clarify when you say internal affairs, what does this actually mean? What are you referring to? And we've kind of seeded that to them. And so when you hear some what they say from an outsider's perspective who doesn't follow China, you're like, oh, that kind of makes sense. He's saying, you stay out of our business and we'll stay out of yours, but that's not at all what he actually means in practice. And I think most Americans kind of get lost into the platitudes, and we don't really understand that when they say that, it's not entirely clear to us what they mean. Now, sure, they want us out of Taiwan. Sure, they want us out of Hong Kong. They want those things, but there's other things that they would consider internal affairs that Americans would be like, no, I don't really think that's an internal affair. That's a matter for the global community or us to be involved in. So Biden and his administration, I think, has to do a better job of making the Xi Jinping and the CCP clarify what those terms actually mean, because then you can actually hold them accountable to it.
Yeah, well, I think you're right on top of a variety of different things in regards to voicing what your thoughts are here on American soil about internal affairs in China. I mean, number one is, you could be, working against the national security law and have some sort of legal ramifications against you for that. Or you just simply, those don't really affect you at all. That's a national security law that's ambiguous, and maybe they're not going to use it against you. Instead, they'll come up with sanctions against you, like they did with 28 individuals the other day in the United States for speaking their minds on various things or imposing certain policies or regulatory ideas towards China. So whatever it is, it's still a cramp down on what they see as meddling in their internal affairs. And that's something that, honestly, we're going to have to continue trying to progress in having the freedom to talk about. And then in things that actually affect us directly as Americans, we're going to have to push back and get them to retreat from encroachment on certain things that we don't agree with, that they might call internal affairs, but are actually affecting our day-to-day existence here. And then with things that aren't internal affairs, external affairs, where they're calling multilateral approaches on things, well, we need to dissect what that is, because if our trade relationship with China right now is a multilateral dynamic and an affair and something that's very collaborative, I would argue it's not, because it's very one-sided. It's tilted towards China. So if you really want multilateralism, China, we need to behave like you really do, which means balanced and fairness with any outside entity that you're dealing with on a daily basis in this multilateralism initiative.
Yeah, and one thing that the U.S. has to do, I think, a better job. When I was in China, I guess 2 years ago now, or a year and a half ago, whatever it was. Anyways, 2019. And you talk to their government officials, and you'd say, well, you guys are doing this. How do you justify that? And they would say, well, y'all are doing this. And so they'd point to things that our government's doing internationally that they view, and in some cases, rightly so, that we're doing that. We're kind of overstepping our bounds. And so I think both sides kind of have to come to the table, kind of be clean. And that's one thing we talk about on this podcast a lot, whether it's how we're striking these international deals, how we're handling each other. There's a lot of, on both sides of the table, kind of covering up what's going on. And China has a lot to say about how we're doing things, and a lot of criticisms that Americans might not want to hear, but are actually fair. And so hopefully the Biden administration will kind of rectify some of those things and clean up some of the talking points, because then you could actually go after China on some of their talking points. But if if you got your fake talking points and they got theirs, you're not going to get anywhere. And that's kind of where we've been for quite some time with them, it seems like.
I'm curious. I wasn't following reaction to his speech as far as other delegates that are at Davos. Did you see anybody speak up and criticize any of that stuff, or was it all like hunky-dory harmony?
I missed it too. I saw the think tank commentator types and kind of the lay of the land opinion, like we're going to war and it's nothing. So I didn't see actually the delegates there that responded to him. And Biden obviously wasn't there, right? Did we send anybody? I didn't even send anybody.
I don't know. We were in the middle of trying to have a peaceful transition in the middle of this thing. And on top of it, I think there is a little bit of an image issue if suddenly ordinary Joe, our normalized president, a guy who identifies with all Americans or whatever that, sort of thematic of his branding is, suddenly, was at Davos, a couple days into his administration. That might seem a little weird and a little I guess elite or however you want to look at it. So I'm actually glad we didn't participate in this particular year from that level. And obviously it's good to get big, powerful, influential people together like that to talk about things. I just, sincerely hope that they're actually doing things that are constructive for the world and not coming up with some sort of Dr. Evil plan.
Well, one other thing on the Xi speech, it says, this is from Axios. It says, throughout the speech, Xi repeatedly returned to the importance of international cooperation on nearly every issue except on those like human rights that he deems internal affairs. And so there's two things to that. One, we've talked about, the World Health Organization or, NATO or not NATO, but United Nations and kind of how those things handle. And I think we have to hold China really accountable on those things. If you want cooperation, then you have to work with the World Health Organization. You can't start saying you can come, you can't come. We're going to give you stuff. We have to just hold them accountable for that. And if they want to push back and say that we're opting in and opting out, okay, then that's a fair conversation to have as well. But part of what Trump was doing there was frustrated with how China was kind of manipulating the situation behind the scenes. And so I think, we have to, and it's not just the U.S. and the Western allies have to actually say, okay, China, you keep saying this, but you're not doing it. And so that's kind of the open door that they're giving us. But then when they open that door, they don't want you to talk about the Uyghurs. And so my fear is that we cede the kind of talking points to say, okay, we're working together on international stuff, and we let the genocide, the atrocities that are going on in China, kind of go behind the curtains. How should we balance it out, Chris? Because some people will want to be more delicate than I am. So how would you say we handle that?
Well, look, I mean, one of the things, it doesn't even, the whole thing doesn't even make sense to talk about unless we actually create a playbook that America is supposed to abide by, and quite frankly, our Western allies too. Like, if we can't all get on the same page about how to engage things that we don't agree with in China, then that's a problem by itself. But then on top of it, if we don't have the consistency around the world, and by the way, Davos always has, for instance, MBS and Saudi Arabians there, they have all kinds of internal affair issues that we're not really supposed to talk about either. As America, we should come up with what is our consistent game plan in regards to engaging these countries that don't, quite frankly, treat human beings the same way or with the values and principles that we hold dearly here in the United States. And by the way, of course, we've had our own issues and our own back history, and it's been terrible, but we'd like to believe that we've progressed into this modern era of an equality that is the treatment of people of all races and colors and creed and sexual identities. If that's really what we want, we should try to establish that basis across the world. And when we don't get it, we should definitely, on a baby step approach, be able to talk about it openly, be able to criticize it openly, be able to provide solutions openly without fear of retaliation. And then past that baby step, hopefully at some point realize, hey, we have the leverage and the ability to use whatever it is, commerce or military might or other pressures on a multilateral or unilateral way to actually progress towards them changing the things that we're criticizing that we feel like aren't right as human beings to behave in today's modern age.
Yeah, and I'll just go back to on those issues. We can't influence Biden or his administration, but what we can do is continue to talk about it. And it kind of sounds cliche, but you're in the movie business. I see Iron Man 3. What did you want people to talk about? I guess Iron Man 3 came out, probably YouTube was around, but it wasn't like it was today, which is when, if there were a new Iron Man movie come out today, Chris, there would be videos with the Easter eggs, the trailer reactions, breaking it down. What does this mean? Rumors, that's what y'all wanted. You want people to talk about it because then it kind of normalizes the conversation. People are involved. Same thing here. That's all we can do is talk about these things. And the more we talk about them, obviously there's a little bit of upward pressure that we can kind of put on our politicians.
Yeah, and I think we're also trying to do it a little different than the red meat pundits, right? Like I think there are major issues that we need to address. I think there's baby step approaches to addressing them. I think there's constructive ways to look at them, talk about them, and possibly implement the kinds of changes that will make us happy as a country and make us better off as a country overall, and hopefully better off as a world. So we're not just out there shouting on a soapbox that people are, terrible people and they need to do this or that, and we're just like throwing them off to the off to the wolves. We're actually trying to create a constructive conversation so that maybe we can start progressing towards smart solutions, because this US-China relationship is definitely one that we need to address ASAP, because it is slowly getting to the point of no return. And if we don't start addressing it, don't start pushing back on encroachment, and I bring up the curfew of a teenager, right? If you don't enforce the 11 o'clock, it becomes 12, and then becomes 12:30, and then becomes 3:30. Well, at some point, it gets so late that it's the next day. And once it's the next day, then there's no curfew. It's the next. So we're getting close to that next day. And unfortunately, that day is really nighttime. That's not a good place where we want to be as a nation in the engagement with China. So we need to work on this quickly.
Yeah. And one thing, let's move to the next story here. I thought about, before, didn't mention this in the pre-show, is Ling Wei and her co-author. I've got the book right here. I can't read. Bob Davis, I believe. They broke a story with the Wall Street Journal that Beijing might be back channeling already to meet with Joe Biden. I don't know if you saw that report. Have any thoughts on it? To me, it was kind of an interesting move. If Xi Jinping or his officials are looking to meet this early. Any read on that?
Well, my read is, always the same, which is I don't want Cold War and I don't want war with China. I want a drastic reset and rebalancing of the relationship, and that's going to take a lot of work and effort. But that's also going to take constant communication with China, our competitive or strategic competitor, which seems to be the term that everybody's using. So I'm all for dialogue between the highest levels of both governments, as long as it's progressing towards a change. If it's dialogue to say, hey, forget that Trump guy, he was sounding this alarm, but we're silencing it. Like, we're going to go back to exactly the way it was prior to him. Like, let's, do that and do it quietly. Let's not put too much attention on it. Like, then I got a real problem. But I will say I'm feeling pretty good about some of the players around President Biden in regards to how he's going to engage with China. We talked about Antony Blinken. He just got confirmed today. We have Kurt Campbell. We have Rosenberger. We have Eli Ratner. This guy, Jake Sullivan seems great. Like, even Janet Yellen, as we talked about. It seems like there's enough hawkishness to try to address the things that are incorrect in the relationship, and I'm hopeful.
Okay, so I'm concerned, and here's why. In the U.S., as we know, the first 100 days is probably the most powerful time, especially with a newly elected president. So Joe Biden in his first 100 days has the most power he will probably ever have. Post midterms, because Joe Biden's going to be a one-term candidate, not being controversial, I think he said it and pretty obvious. Post midterms, if the midterms go poorly for him and the Republicans take back hold, he will basically have no power the last 2 years, right? So he really has a 2-year window, more so the first 100 days, to really do what he wants to do. So the fact that Beijing is reaching out during that time period is a little bit concerning. Like, do they have a read on things that they feel like they can get a deal done with him now that's more to their advantage than waiting when, a few years down? So think like this, Chris. The Republicans take control of the House and the Senate, or take control of the Senate at least, in the midterms, and then Beijing comes out, it's like, hey, we want to do a deal. Well, okay, Biden really can't do a whole lot at that point. And so he would have to kind of bend his will to the Congress. But right now he has a lot of power. He can do a lot of stuff. The fact that Beijing's reaching out so early seems to me to indicate that they might feel pretty optimistic they can get favorable terms with him. It doesn't seem like it's a negotiation from strength in that standpoint. I feel like they've got and I'm not saying like a conspiracy theory willing partner, but they feel pretty good about working with Joe.
Well, I think they feel like, President Biden, I think there were two things, and we talked about this before, long ago, I think pre-election, that that I would argue that President Trump was better in the narrative of communism in China than President Biden, because President Trump just made democracy look really dirty and dangerous and crazy, and communism was much calmer force, right? Like that's the way they would portray it in China. Biden's much more, chill or whatever, normalized. So it's harder to create that, like, oh, look at how disruptive democracy is in the US. I mean, I have a feeling we're going to see some of that coming up here. I just don't feel like everything's just debated and calm and placid now in this country, but maybe it is. But in regards to engaging with somebody that you can get inside the head of, try to understand their point of view, and try to negotiate the best deal possible for your side of the equation, I would say Biden's easier to read and probably an easier negotiating, competitor on the other side of the equation. If I look at another reason why they may have reached out during the first 100 days is that most of the stuff that bothers me about the China relationship and bothers you about it and bothers a lot of other proponents for changing the way we engage with China, a lot of those issues are very slow motion train wreck type of issues that a lot of people don't notice going on, and that's something that we're trying to be really vocal about, and others. And, hopefully we're waking up everybody, as did Trump, to this issue. The one non-slow motion train wreck that I'm sure China is looking at in regards to how will the world react is Taiwan, right? And Taiwan, it's some sort of move on Taiwan by the PRC will be in a very abrupt, brazen China encroachment on the democratic world, right? So that one will wake everybody up to the problem that we have with China for sure, and it might wake us up right into a war, a hot war, as Xi Jinping mentioned. And by the way, his internal affairs also include Taiwan. That's internal to him. Like to everybody else, that's external affairs. To him, that's an internal affair, just the same way Hong Kong was.
No, I agree. I think that's what I was trying to point out earlier, is that when they say internal affairs, you had to say, well, what do they mean? Because how they would define it is not how we would define it, regardless of who's right or wrong. It's just different definitions. The only thing I'd push back on there is, Chris, is that if you talk about Taiwan, they have obviously, and I think we got a story here we're going to get on, we'll go to the next after this, is that, if they're pushing the boundaries with Taiwan, if you want to put, if China wants to continue to push the boundaries, and you're going to say, at the same time, we're going to reach out to the U.S., it's quite possible the U.S. could say no, like, we will first strike, we'll retaliate, whatever we're going to say. So there's kind of a danger there to reach out, and I think even the article mentioned they're worried about being kind of rebuffed on the whole thing. So I'm curious. It's an interesting play because Biden is not weak right now. He is the strongest he will be from political standpoint in the U.S. Reaching out to negotiate with him right now seems like you're not going to get a good deal for China, which makes me wonder, do they think that it doesn't matter when they negotiate with him, they will get favorable terms from their perspective? So it's something to follow, because with the Taiwan issue that's going on, Hong Kong's kind of been put to the side, right? We don't even talk about that anymore. It's kind of gone, sadly. But with the Taiwan issue front and foremost, God, it's just a weird time to reach out, because if they reach out and Biden says, no, you got to back off, what are they going to do? I mean, are they going to back off the end? And so it's a weird play from my standpoint.
Yeah, although I might pull in the art of war and say there's no smarter tactic than to get to know your enemy as well as possible. So they could be trying to facilitate dialogue with Biden and his administration, just simply to learn more about what their stance is on China, what their stance is on Taiwan, how they feel about what happened with Hong Kong, what they're feeling about trade, what they're feeling about South China Sea issues, military issues, national security, cybersecurity, all that kind of stuff, just simply to do reconnaissance work, right? So that's number one. And then if you go to Art of War for a second reason, there's no better time to launch an attack than when your enemy is completely caught off guard and thinking everything's copacetic, right? So maybe I'm just Oh man, maybe I'm just starting to get too cynical about things. I don't want to go there, but there's so many reasons to be cynical, to believe there's nefarious, uh, you know, uh, things that are going on behind the scenes and in the mentality of leadership in China. Um, it's hard to get it out of my head, and it's just the way I'm starting to think about this stuff and trying to put together the chess moves in my head that China might be putting in theirs.
Okay, well, let's talk about Taiwan here as we get ready to close out the show. Last few minutes, two different pieces here. One from the China side of things, and one from Reuters. U.S.-China military's South China Sea posturing continues into Joe Biden era. No surprise there. And then Taiwan Air Force flexes muscles after latest Chinese incursion. Um, Taiwan can flex their muscles, but there's not a lot of meat on that bone. You know what I'm saying? It's not a lot. So when you say flex his muscles, I got a 13-year-old boy, pretty strong for his age, but when he flexes, I can still take him down. He can hit me, it can hurt, but I'm going to win. So flex his muscles, I get it, but maybe a tad bit of a misleading statement there.
Well, I'm curious. Like I have I'm lecturing at the National War College and then at the United States Naval Academy, both in February. So I'm hoping to learn a little bit from the cadets and the officers teaching those courses on what their thoughts are now in regards to Taiwan, because it was pretty eye-opening for me to hear last fall what their thoughts were, and I'm curious how things have progressed over the last 4 or 5 months. I thought those stories were really interesting in the fact that you had China flexing their muscles within Taiwan's, sort of jurisdiction. You had Taiwan doing the same thing within the PRC's jurisdiction. And then you also had the United States doing various tactical and training exercises within both areas. The one thing I didn't see was there anything going on with Australia or the Japanese fleet or Korea or any of our allies, or is it just the three of us all dancing in the same bathtub?
I saw, I think Biden told the Japanese that we're going to back them militarily. I think I saw a headline about that last week. I didn't read into it. Speaking of Taiwan, we got a question here. We haven't discussed it. I haven't been following it too much. Have you looked into this lately? Did you two already discuss Taiwan semiconductors issues? U.S. needs to protect Taiwan for semiconductors. Obviously, it was like 90% or something like that are all produced on Taiwan. It's some crazy number.
Yeah, I mean, well, look, there's been, well, first of all, go back to Taiwan, and then we'll get to Manchester United's question. Taiwan there was, what was it, the 6 principles of engagement with Taiwan that the United States reiterated. I think there was sort of this idea that we weren't going to go back to the original designation of Taiwan, but we're also going to engage with Taiwan in the same way we have been. It was also that we're, a united front against, any sort of external force against Taiwan. They are an ally, blah, 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 blah. So there was an interesting sort of restatement of where we see Taiwan and sort of the reiteration of what just happened about a month ago. The semiconductor business is really interesting to me because if you look at some of the statements Xi Jinping and other Communist Party members have said in regards to their plans over the next short-term horizon in China, one of those is obviously to keep supply chains, remove supply chain issues from external sources and bring them all internal. And a big part of that is obviously the technology supply chain. And semiconductors go right into that. So I'm thinking out loud here, but if you look at, the way Pepsi or Coke operates, right, they sort of got rid of most of their research and development, and they just look for inorganic growth assets to buy that are doing something interesting that could fit within the umbrella. So they go and buy, power water or something,
Yeah.
but or vitamin water or whatever it is. I would argue if you're China and you're trying to secure supply chains in technology and in particular in the semiconductor space, there's no better way to leapfrog into that space than taking over Taiwan and making those semiconductor manufacturing and technology and engineers part of your own rather than some country that's sort of separate from you but also part of you.
Yeah, I was trying to pull up an article. Apologize for the background there. I think it's Panas. Let's see here. There is a group that's looking to build a plant in Austin, Texas. I'm trying to see who that is off the top of my head here. It is Samsung is looking to they've already got a facility down in Austin, and they might be expanding their semiconductor facility down there. So they're also considering Arizona and somewhere else. So you're seeing stuff like that happens. Beyond that, I think you kind of hit it. I talked to him the other day though on the Taiwan issue, and he said that he agreed with our kind of one China policy. And I don't know, maybe historically that's worked. I'm starting to wonder though if we're backing ourselves into a corner with this one China policy, because if we don't do something to separate Taiwan out and to give it full diplomatic status and treat it as its own deal, that we're going to find ourselves in a spot to where what do we do? Because ultimately China will, the PRC will say, this is our island. You have a one China policy. How are you going to respond? So I've been thinking through that. It would be pretty aggressive for the Biden administration, but I feel like we're going to have to get there sooner than later.
You know what? I don't even know if it's something you have to address like proactively, because the one China policy just allows us in a way to put our heads in the sand and have our cake and eat it too. Right. And why disrupt that? The only thing that's going to happen that would make us disrupt that is if China makes a proactive move on Taiwan. And then suddenly we got to look at that and go, well, our policy isn't really the way we're going to react to that. Essentially the bottom line is that policy is fine until it's not. Right. And when it's not, that's going to be when China makes a move on Taiwan. And that's the point where we're going to have to go, this ambiguity situation doesn't really work when you're dealing with weapons and helicopters and jets and aircraft carriers, right? Like you can't really have your cake and eat it too at that point. You're either all in or you're all out.
Well, I think kind of I'll wrap it up my thoughts where I started at, which was pushing back on China by internal, external affairs. What does that mean? I think the U.S. has to eventually clarify what it means. What is our stance with Taiwan? Or how are we treating it? Are we treating it as a nation, even though we're pretending it's not? Can we get the government of Taiwan just to back down, saying that they don't own all of the PRC anymore? How would that work itself out? There are some steps that have to be taken. I don't know exactly how it would work itself out. It might escalate, but if the Chinese are going to continually push the issue, we're going to wake up one day and we're going to have to respond. And then when you're responding to something, you could have been a little bit proactive. And we got a question here, Chris. I haven't seen this. Don't know. What do you know about China passing a law just recently to shoot external fleets, water, air? I haven't seen anything about that.
Oh, that was the PRC gave their Coast Guard the ability to do that. I think that might be similar to what happened in the Senkaku Islands, that dispute in 2012 between Japan and China, where they were both shooting water cannons at each other and creating this whole false flag ridiculousness over these rocks that didn't really have any value whatsoever. But Taiwan obviously does. Now, I guess on the bright side is if China does make that move on Taiwan, we're going to have to decide, are we going to stay one China or are we going to fight back? And depending on the outcome of that, at least it will make it easier for Marriott and Paramount and Delta Airlines and various other entities that can't figure out whether they're allowed to put the Taiwan flag and Taiwan down as a destination or not. So, there's always a silver lining to a lot of this stuff. So that's another thing we're trying to figure out.
Listen, we're going to have a war, but Marriott can list Taiwan on their hotel resorts moving forward.
Exactly. So that will be the key. And then, just to wrap up the show, I will say I thought it was sort of interesting that Xi Jinping looks like he's going to go follow another like anti-graft, anti-corruption, anti-fraud sort of mission again. So it'll be interesting to see what I don't know, dissidents or proactive sort of nemesises of his inside the Politburo, inside the Communist Party, or even inside Hong Kong's, borders. He might be getting rid of because they were found to have, I don't know, mattresses filled with millions of dollars worth of RMB or something like that. And then the other thing I thought was interesting too was to see the Washington Post in an op-ed piece put a good amount of pressure on President Biden to keep the pressure on China and try to make sure that he finishes sort of what Trump sloppily started. I thought that was good to see from a left-leaning publication that has been a little softer on China recently. And then the next thing I think we got to cover at one of these points is, like, I got movie posters behind me, and I think it's really interesting to see how all this anti-American sentiment, all this unrest between the two nations is affecting consumer behavior inside that massive market, to the point where Hollywood, which used to be 90 cents of every dollar, was down to only 16 cents last year, which was like a weird year. But the year before was 34 cents. And I think this year, we're going to be somewhere between 16 and 34 cents, which means we're just losing yet another industry to competitors that we help build in that market. It's just one example of all the stuff that we need to address and rebalance in this relationship.
Okay. I will wrap up this. First off, if you missed the live show, go down to the podcast, Apple, Spotify, anywhere podcasts are found. Leave a rating, review, shoot us notes with comments, just like Man United. And he asked the question. He said, Chris, watch Jim Cramer. He thinks Biden is going to be soft on China. So for what that's worth, there, if you like Jim Cramer and Mad Money.
By the way, soft on China is good for stock markets, and that's what Jim Cramer likes. So that's called talking your book, hopefully.
Yeah. Okay, I'm sure we're going to do at least one more show, maybe two more shows this week. We got a lot to get to. We TikTok, all kinds of stuff we didn't even talk about today. So we'll be back. Download the podcast, and thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, stay safe out there.
Thanks, everyone.